I'm at Ludlow Castle with Matt Lewis, who is an author. He's written plenty of books, non-fiction and fiction, about subjects like the Wars of the Roses. So we're here at Ludlow Castle, which Matt knows loads about, to tell us why it's significant, why it's where it is, what its role was, and why it lies such a quiet and peaceful ruin nowadays. So Matt, tell us first of all, where are we and why is the castle here?
So we're in Ludlow, which is on the Welsh border, kind of middle of the Welsh border between England and Wales. And this is a significant region because it really forms a barrier between England and Wales. The castles were originally sited along here, so this one dates from as early as 1075, so within a decade of the conquest. And it was one of the first castles in England built initially in stone, so there was never a wooden castle here. It was always a stone castle, and that really marks it as a frontier castle. So Wales remained quite wild and untamed for centuries after the conquest, and this marked a fairly wild and brutal frontier. So it was important to have strong castles here. The Normans wanted a strong presence, so Walter de Lacy was given this land and around 1075 started building this castle here. And the rivers, it sits in a kind of crook in the River Teme. So we've got the River Teme to the west and the south. We've got the River Corve just up to the north. So it's kind of protected on three sides by a river. And then we've got the town out to the east over there. So it was a really good strategic position. It was well protected from Wales and well insulated from attack. And it really marked the line that was drawn of the borders of Wales. So along the River Severn, and up through the River Teme, we've got a real long line of castles up here. So we've got Wigmore just a few miles to the south, and there's really kind of a line of fortresses down there that appeared shortly after the Norman conquest.
And were all those fortresses sort of equally weighted, or did Ludlow have a particularly significant
initially they were probably equally weighted, but Ludlow is the one that really came to prominence, initially through the Mortimer family later in its history, who were originally based at Wigmore, just a few miles to the south of here. And then through the period of the Wars of the Roses and into the early Tudor years, this really became a focal point of government and almost effectively the administrative capital of Wales. So its importance grew, possibly because of its good position and also the people who owned the castle over the centuries.
Let's talk about who owned the castle then. So there's been a couple of significant families. You mentioned the Mortimers. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
It started off in the hands of the Lacey family. Through the 12th and 13th century, it passed into the hands of the de Geneville family. And one of the de Geneville heiresses married Roger Mortimer in 1301, and that brought Ludlow Castle into the sphere of the Mortimer family, who, as I say, had been based a little bit down the road at Wigmore. But they were an ancient family. They'd been here since the conquest, and a really powerful and important baronial family on the borders of Wales. And the nature of the borderlands here meant that the lords who lived here and exercised their authority here had a degree of freedom from the control of the king. So they were a buffer between what was seen as the wild Welsh and the English. And depending on which side of the border you were on, I'm sure the Welsh would say the cowed English and the free Welsh. But the Marcher Lords, so this area along the border is called the Marches of Wales. The Marcher Lords were really a pretty brutal bunch, but they straddled both sides of that. They had lands and properties and influence in Wales, and they were perfectly happy to play off Welsh lords and Welsh princes against each other, but they had lots of land and influence on the English side of the border as well. The Mortimers, really, the 14th century marked a huge rise in Mortimer fortunes. So 1327, Roger Mortimer invaded England with Edward II's wife, Queen Isabella. They managed to force Edward II to abdicate his throne in favour of his teenage son, Edward III, who they felt would be a pliable figure that they could mould and control quite easily. And in 1329, it's believed that Roger hosted Edward III at Ludlow Castle here. Edward didn't quite turn out to be such a pliable figure for them, and eventually took the reins of government himself. But Roger, during his time in power, created himself Earl of March, which was a title that the Mortimers went on to hold for a century after that. And it marked a big growth in the importance of Ludlow Castle, and also in its size. The St Peter's Chapel, which is just to the side over there, was built by Roger Mortimer during that period in the late 1320s to mark or to celebrate his escape from the Tower of London in 1323. He escaped from there on the feast day of St Peter ad Vincula, so he named the chapel St Peter's Chapel. And the tower behind us just there is known as Mortimer's Tower, and that was also built as an extra entrance into the castle during that period as well. The Mortimers then, for the rest of the century, their fortunes waxed and waned. So Roger Mortimer, the first Earl, fell from power and was executed when Edward III took the reins of government for himself. But his heirs managed to rebuild the Mortimer fortunes. But then through the late 14th century, there was a lot of minorities. There were some very young Earls of March who weren't really in control of their own lands. But nevertheless, by the time we get to the end of the 14th century, we've got a family who were probably second in wealth only to John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. They'd managed to accrue that kind of a wealth and authority and power out here in the Marches. And then the castle really becomes important and a centre of events going on in the whole nation during the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. So the castle was inherited by Richard, Duke of York, in 1425. The fifth Earl of March, Edmund Mortimer, was the last male heir, died in 1425 without any children, and Richard, Duke of York, was the son of Edmund's sister Anne Mortimer, so he was his nephew and his heir, and so Ludlow and all of those Marcher lands and territories passed into the York family, and really became an important part of the York family's success, because this brought the wealth and the money that the Dukedom of York had really lacked for an awful long time. And frequently through the Wars of the Roses, we find Richard, Duke of York, basing himself here in Ludlow because of its defensible position. Their family seat was actually at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, but I think that was considered possibly a weaker castle, not so easy to defend. This was a real Marcher fortress, and it sat right in the heart of Richard, Duke of York's territories as a Mortimer heir. So he quite frequently, when he was out of favour with the government, would base himself here at Ludlow and sort of hide away behind these walls to get away with whatever he wanted to get away with, to build up his forces. He was able to bring armies here without being interrupted. And all of that really comes to a head. So for the 1450s, he spends an awful lot of time here in opposition to the government. It's from here that he marches out in 1452 to Dartford, where he's eventually arrested by Henry VI and forced to swear an oath of loyalty, and he comes back here for a little sulk afterwards, but starts rebuilding his forces. It's from here that he leaves to go to the Battle of St Albans in 1455, and after that victory he ends up out of favour when Henry VI returns to government, and back to Ludlow Richard skulks. And it really all comes to a head in 1459 when Richard is really out of favour, really struggling, thinks he's being treated unfairly by the government, he's being unfairly excluded by Henry VI. So he starts to raise an army here again in defiance of the oath that he made in 1452. And the interesting thing about 1459, from the point of view of someone who's interested in the Wars of the Roses and the Yorkist family, which I am, it's the first time that we can place an awful lot of the Yorkist family together in one place at the same time. So Richard, Duke of York, moves his family here from Fotheringhay Castle as tensions heighten around the country, so that they're safer here as well. So it's the first time that we can put Richard in the same place as not only his wife Cecily, his oldest son Edward, his second son Edmund, but also their younger children, which includes Margaret, who went on to become Duchess of Burgundy, George, Duke of Clarence, and their youngest child Richard, who would go on to become Richard III. And this is the first recorded time in 1459 that we have all of them here at the same time in early October. So Richard, the later Richard III, celebrates his 9th birthday here And it's one of the things when you walk around the castle, it's a little bit goosebumpy that you think they were walking around these fields, chatting about politics and what was happening in the world. And Richard III could have been up in one of those towers watching his brothers practice down here. Edward, the oldest, was a 6'4" giant of a guy. It was then an 18-year-old soldier, so Richard could have been watching him down here practicing with his sword and with all the other men. And I find that kind of thing really fascinating, just to walk where they could have walked and touch the stones they could have touched. So just after Richard III's birthday, Richard, Duke of York, takes his army and they march out of Ludlow with his oldest two children, Edward and Edmund, with the intention of almost repeating 1452 and going to Dartford, but probably not wanting to get taken prisoner this time. So they march out of Ludlow, they head south down to Worcester. And just as they leave Worcester, they receive word that the Royalist army is coming against them. The reports say that the Royals' army is about twice the size of the army that Richard has, which is bad enough, but also that Henry VI himself is leading the army, riding in front in his armour under the royal banners, which is a pretty terrifying thought. Taking the field of battle against the king was a big no-no. So Richard heads back to Worcester, receives Mass at Worcester Cathedral, swears an oath of loyalty to Henry in front of the Bishop of Worcester, and scurries back to Ludlow again, his little bolt hole out here in the marches. And his men dig in Ludford Field, just over the other side of the River Teme, and they throw up defensive earthworks all around there. Richard, Duke of York, has also got with him his brother-in-law, Richard Neville, who's the Earl of Salisbury, and Richard Neville's son, also called Richard Neville, just for confusion purposes, who was the famous Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. And the Earl of Warwick was captain of Calais at this time, so he's brought over the Calais garrison with him to join the Yorkist forces. And the Calais garrison is probably the closest thing the English crown has to a professional army at this time. So they're quite well-trained, well-drilled soldiers. And during the night of the 11th of October, that Calais garrison, led by a soldier called Andrew Trollope, scale the Yorkist earthworks and run off into the king's camp, into a pardon that the king had promised them. So Richard, Duke of York, and his allies are thrown into disarray. They're not sure whether they've taken battle plans with them, they've taken layouts, numbers of men with them. So the reports sort of suggest that Richard and his noble allies sort of wander the camp, telling everyone, just stay cool for the night, everything will be fine, we'll be back. We're just going to go back to the castle, have a little council of war, a goblet of wine, and we'll be back. So they all head back here to the castle. Some debate must have gone on, but when the sun rose in the morning, they'd gone. The army rose to find all of their leaders completely disappeared. Richard, Duke of York, took his second son Edmund, and they headed off to Ireland. And his oldest son Edward went with the Earl of Salisbury and the Earl of Warwick, and they headed down to the south coast and eventually made it back to Calais, where Warwick was in charge. Ludlow was then completely ransacked by the Lancastrian forces, almost like a captured French town. The Lancastrian army was allowed to sweep through the town, and the chronicle reports talk about inns being pillaged, wine being stolen. The soldiers were drinking in the streets. They were robbing houses, back to the bare walls. They were stealing bedding, everything like that. There's talk about women being raped in the streets. And Ludlow Castle gets robbed as well to the bare walls, as the chronicles described it. And part of the problem, I wrote a biography of Richard, Duke of York, and part of the problem with studying some of his financial records is that they just don't exist, and my suspicion is that they were lost in 1459 when the castle was ransacked. Richard, for some reason, had managed to leave his wife and their three youngest children, Margaret, George and Richard, here, and they were taken into captivity. But Ludlow was really was used as an example for the support that it had provided for the Yorkist lords in opposition to Henry VI. And eventually then we have, a few years later, Edward IV sitting on the throne, so Richard, Duke of York's oldest son, after Richard, Duke of York's death, becomes King Edward IV. So Ludlow then passes into crown hands and becomes a crown property. And in 1473, Edward IV creates the Council of the Marches here, and he installs his then 3-year-old son, Edward, Prince of Wales, as nominal head of that council and head of the castle and the household. And the Council of the Marches was really designed. Edward sets down pretty strict ordinances for the operation of the household, how it needs to work. And it's really designed to provide his young son with a miniature kingdom that he can grow up learning how to rule. So he can use the Welsh marches and the borderlands and his title of Prince of Wales to learn how to build all of those connections and how to operate politically on a smaller stage, so that he's ready then for the national stage. Unfortunately, that Edward went on to become Edward V, who was king briefly in 1483 before he was deposed by his uncle Richard III. But in the early 1490s, in 1493, Henry VII, the first of the Tudor kings, grants this castle to his oldest son, Prince Arthur, and recreates the Council of the Marches with Arthur again as nominal head. And Arthur is here repeating exactly what Edward V had been doing, so learning how to build those connections, how to operate politically and astutely, ready to bring him onto the national stage. And in 1501 we have Prince Arthur arriving here with Catherine of Aragon to live their married life here, which, as we unfortunately know, was brief. It was only the next year that Arthur passed away. And again, Ludlow's thrown into a little bit of a hiatus. Arthur's body stays here for an awfully long time before it's moved down to Worcester, where it's buried. And the chronicle reports give a strong sense of the mourning in the town. Personal mourning, I think, for the death of Arthur, but also mourning the loss of the connections that those people had built up. So people around here would have been relying on their connection to Prince Arthur to keep them in jobs when he became king. But the castle stays in Crown hands. It becomes again important in the 1520s. We have Princess Mary, who was later Mary I, here for a period of about 19 months, again installed in the Council of Marches. And then through the Tudor period it starts to become a little bit less important. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, uses his influence to have Sir Henry Sidney appointed president of the council and installed at the castle here. But then it's probably from the late 16th century that we really start to see the decline in both the influence and the buildings of the castle.
So did anybody live here after, so once Mary had left then, was there anyone significant live here after? Oh sorry, so you got Henry Sidney.
Sidney was probably the last significant famous sort of resident at the castle. It was still effectively, through all of those, through the 15th and 16th centuries, almost like the capital of Wales. It was where Welsh administration happened. There was an awful lot of judicial business going on here, and it was really a hub of not only the marches but also Welsh government. Right. But it really begins to slip in influence after that. 1616 we do have James I coming here with the future Charles I to invest him as Prince of Wales in this castle, which again shows how important it still was at that time.
Yeah.
But then the English Civil War, the blight of so many of England's castles, the English Civil War breaks out. Ludlow declares for the royalist side, but eventually falls to the parliamentarians. They actually don't slight the castle as they had with so many. So Bridgenorth Castle just down the road was slighted, and there's virtually nothing left except for a tower that leans at a higher degree than that Leaning Tower of Pisa. But they don't slight Ludlow Castle. There's damage done to the castle, but they install a garrison here for the rest of the Civil War. And they also don't repair the damage that was done. So it really does mark the start of the decline of the castle. Anywhere
they stuck a garrison really did suffer, didn't it, from just being used by that many men who didn't really care for it.
And the period after that, Charles II tries to reinstate the Council of the Marches, and it does exist for a period of time but doesn't really have the influence that it had before, and is eventually disbanded just before the end of the 17th century. And by this point there's records of estimates for repairs to be done to the castle which are just escalating and escalating and escalating, and no one wants to pay the repair bill. So it eventually just slips into disuse. It gets overgrown with ivy, the roofs start to fall in, and it really is left then as a ruin for an awfully long time. And it isn't till the end of the 18th century when the English start to get interested in touring romantic ruins and visiting old castles that it starts to see a bit of a revival in its fortunes. Towards the end of the 18th century, the leasehold is bought from the Crown by the Earl of Powys, Henry Herbert, and in 1811 his heirs purchased the freehold to the castle, citing the amount of effort that they've put in to repairing and restoring the castle and operating it as an early form of tourist attraction. And they managed to secure the castle, and it still remains in the hands of the Earl of Powys at the moment as a privately owned castle, and it's operated by the Powys Estates. And they really spent then the next kind of 200 years turning it into the tourist attraction that it's become today. There's a lot of archaeological work done here at the start of the 21st century, and an awful lot of repairs have been done to get it to the condition that we see today. The castle buildings just over to our side there are now used as a hotel accommodation. You can get married here at Ludlow Castle. You can stay in the rooms, in the castle rooms there. There's a wonderful tea room and shop here, and it really is the hub of a fantastic little market town. Ludlow has a great reputation for local food and local produce, and a wonderful market that happens here, and the castle really is the hub of that now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.